Unfiltered. Today we have a very special guest named Sherri, and she is going to talk to us about her challenges as a second career special education teacher. And I think it's going to resonate with so many of you all today. So, Sherri, I would love to ask what originally got you interested in becoming a teacher?
That goes all the way back to basically when I had my daughter. I have one daughter who is on the autism spectrum. And for the first 12 years approximately of her life, I actually worked in the medical field, which helped me learn a lot about her diagnosis. But in 2015, after having been through years and years of ARD meetings, trying to sift through the IEP jargon, which is, I mean, they could do a degree on that in college, as far as I'm concerned, and it would still be confusing because it changes. At that point in 2015, I started getting really interested in ABA therapy because I'd done some reading on it. And one of my daughter's teachers started telling me a little bit about it, and I was trying to implement it at home, just do whatever I could to help. And so the more I looked into it, I really got interested in and maybe doing it for a job. Unfortunately, those saints do not get paid what they should get paid for the job that they do. Teaching is one thing, and we can do a lot to help students with autism, but ABA therapists are like on the front lines. They a lot of the time they help get kids even ready for school who are on the spectrum, like related to behaviors, things like that. So in 2015, I arranged something with my full-time employer that I would work part-time as an ABA therapist, and I paid for the certification myself. They call it a registered behavior technician. There's been different names for it over the years. But I started doing that. I basically worked 7 days a week because I would work on weekends with the kids in ABA groups. And if it had paid enough, I probably would have gone and done it full time. And so I was still working in medical at the time. And then I had a conversation with one of the other therapists because I helped my daughter learn to read, and I noticed that they never worked on anything academic. At that time, I think it's changed since then, but at that time, I was told that ABA therapy is not academic. There was a rule in place. Now, granted, I wasn't in Texas when I did this. I was living in Washington State at the time, so their rules might have been a bit different down here. But at that time, I was told they don't work on academics. It's just behaviors and things like that. So getting them, basically able to function in public or things like that. And so it would help in school, but I was, never assigned to like help them learn to read, work on any kind of academics. So I reached a point in 2015 where I was like, I think I actually kind of want to see about being a teacher because I wanted to dig in and do all of that stuff for academics for them. So I was working at a hospital here in where I live, working nights of all the things. And then during the day, I went and pursued alt certification to be a teacher.
Wow, now that is a really intense journey. I'm kind of curious, once you went through your teacher certification program, once you got in the classroom, did you feel like it had adequately prepared you for what the actual job would be like?
My very first year as a teacher, I've been in special education the whole time. My first year was in a behavior classroom. This is for students who need to be there to calm down. Some kids just cannot be in the gen ed classroom because of the class size, things like that. That was my first year. So I already kind of knew what I was walking into with. These were going to be kids that were really challenged in some ways with behavior. And I will tell you, though, I did not expect it to be as intense immediately. Within the first, I want to say 3 days of teaching, I had a student break things in my class and then burst into tears. And that is trial by fire because you're like, okay, all right, I'm trained for this. How do I get to this kid and try to see what's going on, how to calm him down? I was really lucky that it kind of worked. Me and that student kind of clicked right away. So I was able to kind of get that. That was the only time he ever did that in my room because we kind of established some boundaries. Okay, I'm not going to put up with every single thing like this. We're getting to know each other. And now you know how I am because it's, it is not going to happen in my room.
Wow. And I'm sure a lot of people also want to know, what were some of the behaviors like just on a day-to-day basis?
The biggest behavior that I always saw was, especially when I started it, I was a middle school teacher at first. These kids who struggled to read or struggled with math, particularly SPED students, they had such low confidence in the behavior that we would get just because I firmly believe they were embarrassed. They didn't want to be wrong for the umpteenth time. At least that's the way they would see it. That, I mean, you would get all kinds of defiance over something simple. As simple as, okay, I'm not asking you to read this entire story to me. I would have kids who would struggle, but I would have them, as I read, just follow the text with their finger on the page, because then at least they're getting exposure to the print, and things like that, to where they're at least engaged and not just waiting for me to finish. So that was the majority of what I saw, is just work task avoidance. I wouldn't even say just, classwork avoidance, basically just like trying to fly under the radar, pretend that I'm not there. And then when you mix with that the preteen situation in middle school, yeah, there would be days where it's like, I'm not your enemy. I wish you could see it a different way than that. But yeah, that's probably been the most common behavior situation I've dealt with in my career so far.
And I know that we've heard and seen a lot of examples of pretty severe violence, especially in special education classes. Did that come up for you at all during your time?
Yes, I unfortunately very little, but there was one incident when I taught high school for a couple of years, and namely I taught what was called an English resource class. These were students who, it would range anywhere from students who were severely dyslexic, students who were in alternative learning environment, to where it was counting as a language credit for them because they really struggled with reading comprehension. So it was a real hodgepodge of, I would just say, struggling readers for whatever reason. So in that class, I had a student in particular who, his home situation was pretty dicey. And we all knew that. And as a campus, he had 2 other siblings that went there, so everybody was pretty familiar with his situation. But he kind of decided that I was the person that he was not going to deal with that year. And so I'm one of those teachers. I firmly believe that sometimes a student just, you're not their cup of tea, and it's not your job to try to become their cup of tea. You kind of just try to work it out and at least, have a peaceful year. This particular student, I was in the process of actually sending an email to an administrator who had a question about a different situation. Little did I know that he had been in an area he should not have been, participating in an activity he should not have been doing. And he believed that I knew, and that I was emailing admin about him. So he quickly became enraged, and he says, I know what you're doing over there. You need to stop right now, because it's not what you think it is. And at this point, I'm totally confused, because he's supposed to be working on a quiz that I gave him. And I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? But I'm also trying not to escalate it. So I'm kind of going, okay, just get the quiz done. We're good. Everything's fine. He did not believe me. He was set on that. And he says, you need to stop right now. And he walks all the way across the classroom to the desk where I'm sitting there, just trying to finish like a 2-line email, also trying to monitor the other kids working, things like that. And he comes right up to me and he says, why are you not listening to me? And I said, I have to get this done. I have to send this email real quick. And he said, you need to look at me. You need to stop what you're doing and look at me right now, because I'm talking to you. Now, this young man is about 6'2". I'm about 5'7", so I'm not going to win that situation. But I also thought, okay, if I explain this to him again, hopefully he'll understand it. I said, this is not about you. And he went and sat down for a minute. And then I don't know what happened. To this day, I still really don't understand it. He came back up to my desk and he said, I'm trying so hard right now to do something that I know I should not do. And he's looking me in the face. And I'm like, I don't know what you mean by that, but threatened is not something I'm going to be in my classroom. And so I called admin and I had them come in, and I told them when they got there, I don't understand the situation. He's completely agitated and is out of control. Meanwhile, he overturned my desk, threw my chair across the room. And what ended up happening is he already knew that someone had ratted him out to the police on campus. He knew it was just a matter of time. So he firmly believed I was involved in the situation, but I wasn't. So yes, that was probably the closest I ever came to like what I would consider like a violent situation involving myself.
Wow. And I know that there's an intense debate within the teacher community about what consequences should look like for special education students. So, how do you have any kind of discipline practices in place or consequences in the world of special education?
That is one of the trickiest topics in what I do, because I think what I see over the years, and it's well intentioned, I really firmly believe that, especially in the case of gen ed teachers, I think they try to be fair with everyone, but it also becomes like a hindrance because there's a common, I'll say a misconception, although I don't think it's ill meant, that because a student has an IEP, the discipline rules don't apply to them. And it's not, it can be a little bit complicated, but other than students who have like a specific like behavior intervention plan where they specifically struggle and or qualify in an area related to behavior, other than those relatively few cases, the normal rules should apply, and they usually do, because I've been lucky, the campuses I've worked at tend to see student first and then IEP, which is probably the best way to go about it, because at the end of the day, sure, we could kind of overlook things, but when these students graduate and they're in the real world, the IEPs won't matter anymore. There's a content creator on social media, I cannot remember his name, but he does really, really good little like mini lessons for teachers about how discipline is discipline. It exists in the world, not just in the classroom. So yeah, I would say that the approach that is probably the best one to take is just remember that these are human beings. For right now, they're a student, but we should keep in mind that they need to be a functional adult one day.
That's amazing. I think your school must be a unicorn school because, in my experience and the experience of hundreds of teachers, we've found that if we've had a student in a general ed classroom that has a 504 plan or an IEP plan, we've been told if the misbehavior is a result of the disorder, then essentially we can't do anything to give a consequence in that situation. So I
That's a
was kind of shocked by
shame.
that.
Oh my goodness. I will say that you're right. We do have to take different situations into account. But yeah, I will say the admin at this particular campus, they're very, very understanding. You might even say kind of old school about it, because they realize, the behavior isn't just something that's, impacting that student, but the whole campus is going to be impacted by that. And especially, I teach fifth grade this year, and it is amazing what you see these kids kind of have to process and just deal with. But I will say this, we do have to kind of step lightly around a lot of situations. But by and large, our admin is very understanding that, okay, we have a whole class to take care of. And, things need to just be nipped in the bud sometimes. So yeah, I am pretty fortunate there. I have been at campuses that don't do such a good job.
Wow. So I'm kind of curious, what would you say has been your biggest struggle or frustration or irritation as a special education teacher?
Oh my goodness. I risk sounding bitter, and I'm not. I actually can't imagine myself doing anything else. In fact, I'm about to start a doctoral program for what I do now. So my disclaimer is that I love my job, and I really do. I really do. I would say the biggest challenge so far has been that the world of special education changes a lot. Laws change all the time, and it's confusing, and I get that. But we special education teachers are the stretched even further than gen ed teachers are. And that's not to belittle what gen ed teachers are going through. All of us overworked, underpaid, and just, you're rewarded for doing your job well by having more put on your plate. And it's extremely stressful. And I have always worked with a pretty good team of gen ed teachers, but we're getting to the point now because of being short on teachers everywhere and special education shortage, at least in Texas, as far as I know, it's even worse. It is extremely unusual to have a set place where you co-teach, which means that in a given day, I'm in and out of 4 classrooms, squeezing in IEP support minutes where I can. And I just don't have the opportunity to really follow these students through the day. One thing that I've tried to do several times in 2 different districts is talk to the district administration about implementing case managers where that's their sole responsibility. I would love to see districts do that, because having to fit in working with students who at any given day, they have different needs. I would say the special education students it's a very, very rapidly changing situation where one day they need so much help, and then the next day, hey, they've got it, and the light bulb turns on and stuff like that. And then we have ridiculous data expectations that we're supposed to do, and then prepare an IEP. And for 5th graders, that transition to middle school, most students have 2 ARDs per year. So that, let's see, if I have a caseload of 12, that's almost 24 ARDs a year.
What's
on
an
top
ARD?
of being, oh, I'm sorry. I get into jargon. I apologize.
Oh, you're fine.
ARD it's a meeting where you develop the next school year's education plan. So basically you sit down with parents, with a gen ed teacher. The case manager also represents the special education side of it. And you go over, okay, here were their academic goals, behavior goals, whatever, from the previous year. And you kind of talk about, okay, are we still working on this goal? Are we ready to move on to something else? And you basically plan that out in what's called an individualized education plan, or IEP. And so for 5th graders, my 5th graders usually have to do that twice, because the way SPED schedules and accommodations work in middle school, some of them change. And then you also have to cover what accommodations they need for state testing, which are different once they move to middle school. So that alone could be a full-time job. And then add to that, I'm supposed to dip into 4 different classrooms with 4 teachers who have 4 teaching styles through the day. So you kind of become a chameleon, and just to survive it.
Wow. So I would love to hear more about the co-teaching model, because in my mind, teaching live with another human sounds like something out of my nightmares. So can you tell us what that's like?
I will tell you, it is a rare talent, unfortunately, and I feel for teachers. Nowadays, there's so many numbers of SPED students in pretty much every campus you go to, that a couple of teachers are basically going to be voluntold, okay, this is what you're doing. And sometimes it meshes real good, and sometimes it does not. And I've seen both situations. Because it's hard enough just to get into your own groove as a teacher and kind of know, okay, here's how I'm going to run my class. This is what works for me. And then you get paired with someone else who either there's like 3 possible scenarios. One is they just want to stay in their lane. They want you to stay in your lane, and you don't do things the same, but you kind of just coexist. You agree to disagree on most things. 2, and this was my first co-teaching situation for 3 years in middle school, where we bounced ideas off each other, and it was actually an amazingly productive co-teaching relationship. And then I've also had others where it made them very nervous to have another adult in the room, even though I've always tried to be very accommodating. It's funny. It's funny. Once you provide accommodations to students, you kind of just see it everywhere. And so I would be with a gen ed teacher and realize, oh, okay, this kind of stresses them out. I'm going to try not to do that so much, and things like that. but some people just don't want to do it. And I don't believe that people should be pushed into doing that, but it's become such a necessity that it is really difficult. And I've told many teachers before who are like, I don't like this model. I don't like how this is done. And, it's just too much fluctuation. And I'm like, yes, it is. It's not ideal in any way. In a perfect world, we would have a lot more training for teachers that had to go into this, and to where at least they would know what to expect in some way. But the fact of the matter is they don't provide very much training at all. I actually pushed for them to do more at my area of the campus or the district that I work in. And they actually have started scheduling monthly, like sit down training, talk about what this should look like between co-teaching teams. And so far the reception's been okay. But yeah, they should be doing this kind of stuff during PD week for these teachers.
Wow. So I'm still trying to picture what it looks like. Do you lecture too? Do you alternate? Or are you just with like one or two kids kind of like whispering to them about what to do? How does it actually work?
Well, I will say that there's probably no wrong answer on how to do co-teaching other than one teacher just doesn't do anything. That's probably the only way to get it wrong. But there's a few different models that they use in this district, or in the couple of districts that I've been with. And I think it's pretty standard. I don't know too much about how they do that in other states, but there's a couple of models. One is called One Teach, One Assist, where it's usually the gen ed teacher, but it could go either way. An example of that is, say that one teacher is lecturing, and yes, I have before in certain, like if I'm particularly skilled at teaching a certain lesson, then yes, I could lead the lesson that day, while the other teacher keeps an eye on students, whether they're falling behind, and maybe help cue the lesson to slow down here and there if we need to, or be writing notes at the same time for the kids to follow along with. It basically kind of splits up the workload to where you can kind of just be focusing on the part that you're doing. There is another one called parallel teaching, which I'm a huge fan of, because when you have a class that has a wide variety, and for sped co-teach classrooms, this is just across the board, you have the ability to split the class in half, or at least in larger groups, to where you can use a different text, perhaps shorter or leveled down in Lexile level or reading level, for students who need that, but they're still learning the same skill. But that way you can fine tune it much more to what that student can digest, and hopefully then you show as close as possible to all of them showing mastery for that lesson. And that one I'm a huge fan of, because it gives both teachers the opportunity to actively teach almost every day. So everyone gets a chance to hone their skills. So that's a good one. The one that they really, really love in the districts I've been with is called station teaching, which most people, if you teach, what that is in some way. But the difference with a sped teacher is that rather than kind of just facilitating and supervising movement through the room, you have each teacher at a specific station that you need them to do an exit ticket for, or that is critical to the lesson, to where you might even have students who struggle with getting things done in that much time, only have them do 2 of 4 stations. But it also, the main point of it is that you make sure that both teachers get to work with every student. And that can help in a lot of ways, because I loved, ELA was like my thing. If I could teach ELA for the rest of my life, I would probably do it. Although I like 5th grade. I've had to force myself to learn to teach things that I don't really love to teach. So it's been good for me. But there are certain things, like when we would do our Shakespeare unit, which for 6th grade, you just kind of dabble in it a little bit. I would be like, okay, I'm doing this one. I got this one. I'm going to teach this. So yeah, the structures really give both teachers a chance to kind of have an equal part in what we do. Now, I will say that teachers who have been teaching for 10, 12 years and have not done that before, it is a very steep learning curve because it's a foreign concept. Wait a minute, what are you doing in my room? To where it's difficult. It's difficult, and the expectation, unfortunately, too often becomes, okay, here's what I'm going to deal with. You need to go deal with this. And I don't think I don't think it's ill intentioned. I don't think it's meant to be mean. It's just, I cannot deal with this. This is asking too much. And so I understand it, but it really does make doing my side of the job really difficult, because especially when I've moved from one to the other, going from a really productive partnership to one where it's like, please just don't get in my space. It's really sad, and and it makes you feel as a SPED teacher like you're not really able to contribute as much as you could. So yeah, that's co-teaching ideally is a lot of back and forth, and both teachers contributing at least a little bit every day, whether that's the SPED teacher helping with warm-ups and recursive review for tests and things like that. Ideally, that's what it would look like. It doesn't always, though, unfortunately.
Interesting. I have so many questions coming to mind, but one is, we just have to know, has there ever been drama, cat fights, like anything really crazy in this whole co-teaching situation?
I have probably seen every situation you could imagine. And unfortunately, it's just because teaching is an art and so many different personalities come into it. I know for me, I'm kind of a private person, especially at work, because I was never that person that's going to share my life with colleagues. One, I get stressed out. Having a long conversation at work on top of work is like mentally draining. But I've worked with teachers that bothered them, that I wasn't going to talk about my kids and everything like that during the day, when I'm focused on, okay, I'm going to be that teacher that at contract hours, I have got my job done. So what I tend to be kind of, singularly focused, and that helps me feel better at the end of the day. But I've worked with people that really bothers them, and they take it as being standoffish, that I have a problem with them, which isn't the case. But on the other hand, I've also seen situations where you can truly be like buddies. Now, as far as like, I guess the term would probably be backbiting. It does exist. I have seen it. And there are just some people, some situations that are just too stressful. And unfortunately, it becomes a situation where you're used to the stress. And for me, it hasn't quite gotten that far, but I've definitely seen situations where it's almost like it's not a normal day if there's not a problem, which is terrible. But as you know, that's almost the state of things as far as being a teacher these days, whether it's dreading admin talking to you, or, being worried that the comment you made during, planning time was someone saying, oh, you're saying I'm not doing my job, and things like that. Or in the case of SPED, isn't that her job? Isn't that what she's supposed to be doing? When a lot of those things are fluid, it could go either way. It's not a set in stone. Okay, you're dealing with this because I don't have time for this. That can get really complicated and pretty icy in situations at work.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine, just with, I guess the closest thing that I've experienced that's like this is departmentalization in elementary, where three different teachers would all share the same kids, but they would rotate for different subjects. And I've just seen no end of fighting, even to the point where it would seem like one teacher was trying to sabotage the other and letting the kids complain, oh, we hate this teacher, her work is blah, blah, blah. And that's really hard. And then I've kind of seen almost like alliances form, where it's maybe like two or three teachers against one. And I almost wonder if it's worth it, and if it would be easier to just literally separate the kids and have one teacher with a smaller group and the other teacher with a smaller group, rather than to try to do it somehow with both teachers in the same room. What are your thoughts on that?
That is interesting. And there's actually, I want to say his name is, I think his name is Justin Bader. He does some videos from the point of view, I think, as a principal. And he has recently kind of jumped on the bandwagon of pulling away from inclusion, which is the generalized statement for, okay, we're not going to seclude or isolate students, who have special education services. And I think it's one of those things that it's worth considering based on that campus's needs, whether inclusion is appropriate. So I would kind of say yes in some situations to that question, because I've definitely been at campuses where the needs of some students is kind of in the bubble. It's not to the point where they need to be like in a self-contained environment, but they certainly are not at the point of keeping up with like the ones that are closer to grade level or even advanced. The sad part of inclusion is that there's always some part of the population of the classroom that you're not really able to attend to very well. And that's tragic, unfortunately. I would think the thing that I would like to see, especially at elementary level, is for them to go back to having more what they've called it resource, different things like that, where you have a dedicated set of or amount of time for those students that are significantly behind. And that is where they do that classwork. Because right now what they're doing is they're fitting it in to where that student has, like I have several students who have reading with their homeroom teacher, and then I have to pull them for reading intervention out of that time. So in a way, they're even being given even more, rigor to do. And I would kind of like to get away from that, because in middle school, it's very common to have what's called like a resource or an applied class, where that student, let's say they're in 6th grade, but their reading is at 2nd grade. They learn those TEKS in an environment where you can seriously adjust the reading level of the text, and they can still learn it. And you can also take a pace that's better for them. I really think that's worth looking into more, especially elementary, because you'll have more opportunity to kind of, I don't like the term bridge the gap, but essentially that's what it is, because, you have more time you can work with there than when they have, 6 or 7 or 8 classes.
Yeah, something that comes to mind that seemed to also be a huge debate when I was teaching was basically whether or not our special education students should be working on grade level standards or whether they should be going back to the earlier grades that we missed. And we got a whole lot of mixed messages because for the most part, it would seem like admin would say, no, everybody needs to be learning, the 6th grade standards, even if somebody was reading on like a 1st grade level. And we would kind of argue like whether it's math or reading, if they don't have the foundations, there's no way they could do grade level material. And it just ended up being a mess. So how does that kind of work in Texas?
That is one thing. My first co-teacher I grew up in Illinois, where it's a very, very different picture there. And she said, I cannot stand how Texas is data driven. It's ridiculous, and I was like, I grew up in Texas, so I didn't know any different. I said, what do you mean by that? And she goes, it all comes down to tests here. That's all they care about. And I said, oh, and I really started thinking about it. I was like, yeah, and my husband worked at a campus where day one, they started doing interventions and practice 4-star, which is our standardized test. And I could not believe that. I've never been in a situation that strict. But as far as like, it's so tricky, because you'll have a class where most of them can learn or are ready to be learning those grade level skills in one unit. And then the next unit, most of them are far behind it. So it takes so much adaptation to that. And that's been a point of contention that I've had with teachers in the past, is this is kind of an argument that because they struggle with number fluency, which nowadays sadly is most students, because in one unit they struggle so much with that the next unit comes around and they're like, okay, well, why do you want them working on this when they can't do it? And the sad truth is, and I have to tell them this sometimes, they're being tested on this. They need exposure to this, because how they look at testing scores, especially for special populations, is, okay, did they have growth? They don't even care if they passed. It's just, okay, did we get a couple more questions right? based on this TEK. And there again, I also believe that, different students will have a knack for different things. So I definitely like all students having access. And that's the main word that we use in IEPs and planning for students is access. Are we asking that a SPED student, passes every class? Not exactly. There's such a thing in the state of Texas as graduating by IEP, meaning that even if a student doesn't pass their end of course exams for high school courses, that they can still graduate. And I have mixed feelings on it, but I do think it's fair in situations where, because of a learning disability, they struggle more, regardless of how hard they've worked, to improve. So in that case, I think that at a fundamental level, I think that all students should be able to see, at least be taught in some way, the grade level content, because every now and then you'll have a student that they struggle terribly with division, but they understand fractions and they can do really well. That's the big thing. It's so dynamic. It can change so much.
That's so interesting. One question that I was going to ask that you touched on was the idea of everybody passing no matter what. And that's something that has gone into now general education. But I know for a while before that was the case for everyone, some people were concerned that the students themselves realized that, hey, I don't really have to do that much work. I'm going to get passed no matter what. Or, I have this label. Do you see that affecting their morale and their motivation at all? And how do you get over those obstacles?
You mean as far as student achievement?
Mm-hmm.
I actually, it kind of depends on the age level. As far as my experience has been, when you have students who have, performed, lower than expected, especially grade levels lower, by the time they get to high school, they pretty much are aware of the situation. And a lot of them, it's kind of hard to get them invested again. A lot of them actually are, and in high school, I worked at a very at-risk population high school, and those students, a lot of them were already working, things like that, to where they, graduation was kind of like, okay, yeah, if I get around to it kind of situation. My younger students, they tend, because in elementary, they still are kind of at the age where they want positive reinforcement and feedback. I find that being engaged with them gets more out of them. I have a student in particular this year who I was warned about. Oh no, he's not going to do anything. He's just going to be defiant. And I've seen a lot of growth in him this year, just because I haven't focused on, okay, well, you're so far behind with this. You have to really, really work on this. I think at the younger age, you kind of have to let that, you kind of have to like not get into it too much. I hate to say minimize it, but I guess in a way it kind of is, because at that age that is where they're real sensitive, and you can kind of stall that sense that they gain of, okay, I'm not like these other students. And I think it's a good goal to strive for it. You can't always accomplish it necessarily, but I think definitely at the older grades, is when they start to really feel like, okay, I'm not like these other students, so why should I bother?
That makes sense. And a controversial question popped into my mind. So sorry I didn't, forewarn you about this. But I was kind of curious if you feel like there is an overdiagnosis in the special education world that's just filling it up with students that don't really need it. And if some parents are really pushing for their kids to have labels when maybe they don't really need them.
Well, I will tell you, I have a controversial opinion on that. I was wondering if you were going to ask me that question. And that's part of my dissertation, and my doctorate program is going to lean on this a little bit. I am a firm believer, because I've already seen, just in the decade I've been teaching, so much change, and the range of eligibility areas has like tripled since I started teaching. So it did bother me, and I've been looking at it for a while now, and I'm like, okay, are we getting to the point where, the SPED population is going to outnumber gen ed? Because at the rate that it's going, it's possible. I'm sure there are schools out there that are almost at 50-50. I'm sure of it. And at the start of my career, dyslexia was not considered an area of eligibility because we had students who had dyslexia who could still, handle grade level content, pass the standardized tests, everything like that. But that has changed. And now I think it was just last school year, maybe even this school year, where now it's an eligibility. So what is happening is all of these students in third grade, I believe, is where they officially can have their initial placement in special education. I think it's earlier intervention before that. Now the numbers are just amazing because we'll have students that, based on, they could have gone along on like a 504 plan, which is just shy of SPED. Typically we want to see, okay, can accommodations take care of it to where we don't have to have a special education teacher involved, things like that, because there are many students that can just a little bit of accommodation here and there, and they can still do well in the curriculum. But the numbers are just insane. And I don't know if I fully fleshed this out earlier, but SPED teachers are usually stretched across grade levels, especially in elementary. It's not uncommon for a teacher. I know we have one on the campus. She's amazing. She teaches in 3 and all of them are tested. So it's a shame that as that number climbs and these students are needier in some ways, and we have less staff. So unfortunately, that's not a situation that's going to get any better. It's also part of why I've tried to suggest that, okay, we need to have, if we're going to ask SPED teachers to work in 3 different grades, then we need to have someone dedicated to handling paperwork and handling IEPs and collecting their data, because it's just too much for a single person, especially when, you're across grade levels and the intake of SPED students is just exploding. So hopefully that's a good answer to that question.
Yeah, I have kind of a follow-up question too. I have heard that a lot of behavioral challenges are now being labeled as special education, so maybe emotional disturbance or oppositional defiance. But I'm sure that that is different from state to state. Have you seen a lot of kids getting labeled just solely on how they're behaving and put into the special education label?
I will say that compared to other diagnoses or eligibility areas, it's less. The state of Texas, as I've seen so far, and it's a huge state, so it could be different in different areas. I think that that's something that's not as well defined, and I think probably the age of the student has a lot to do with that, because it's not a terribly clear diagnostic area. And I think with emotional disturbance, which I have run into before, it's not uncommon that a student is diagnosed with that much later because they're trying to rule out other things like ADHD, if they're on the spectrum, and especially if they're younger and they're still trying to figure that out. You do want to make sure that you know that first, because it can be an entirely different approach for that student. And so in my experience, ED and things like that, like specific behavior diagnoses are not as common. 90% of what I see is like a learning disability in reading, math calculation. Dyslexia is the big one now, especially because now they're basically entitled to an IEP now if they have dyslexia. And I mean, it's a good thing because they'll get a lot of support. But I also think it might be, I wish they were a little more graduated in how they assess that need. But yeah, that's kind of what I've seen.
Interesting. And I'm curious, what is it like working with the parents? Do you find that they are very involved, or do you find sometimes that they're like, oh, you're the special education teacher, you got this covered?
I have run the gamut. When I was working in high school, because it was an at-risk neighborhood and area, very low parent engagement. I mean, I was lucky if in my class that I had that one year of 22 students, I was lucky if I could get 3 on the phone. And so I hate to say it, it became a situation where you realize admin of this school is raising these kids, admin and teachers. And so, yeah, I've seen some really difficult just unengaged situations. I've also seen, and this is usually more in elementary, I had a student where this was during the year where we had to do virtual learning. And she was just the sweetest little girl. And she worked so hard every day. She never got to come back to school that year. She was virtual all year long. And she was just a joy to see every day. And her family could not get it out of their head that their daughter struggled significantly, was not making progress, and was just, I don't know if they were overwhelmed. I kind of, having been on both sides of a ARD meeting or a SPED meeting, as a parent and then as a teacher, I understand that it's really overwhelming, and that if you're worried for your child, sometimes it's really easy to only see, okay, this is a problem, we got to fix it. But this one situation was to the point where I'm telling them, okay, she doesn't need pull out specialized instruction for reading, because now she's only about one year behind grade level, and she can make that up. And they would not hear it. They just did not agree with me. They said, no, we're seeing it at home. She's really struggling. This isn't helping her. And I didn't know, I had nowhere to go after that, to where I had to have a principal step in. Luckily, he was very practical about these kinds of things. And he said, listen, we're holding her back if we do this. And the parent kind of was like, okay, we can try it. But, it was that, I've seen that before, where it's just, you want to be protective of your kid, but it gets to the point where you're like, no, don't make them do something that's going to upset them or frustrate them and things like that, because they're already overwhelmed by it.
Makes sense. And I'm also kind of curious about how the pandemic changed special education or affected it.
Special education during the pandemic was very challenging, especially because that year was at 2020 or 2020 to 2021. That school year, I had a hybrid class the whole year. I had a few students that never came back on campus. And that was, to do that and accommodations was extremely challenging. It was like rewriting the way it's done, because there's accommodations you can't do anymore. Like for students who struggle with writing, I would give them lined paper or a whiteboard that has little handwriting lines on it, and they would practice, and things like, you couldn't do that anymore, to where I would have to have them write for me and hold up their work to the camera. And I would have to take a screenshot so I could see, okay, they have a handwriting goal. What's their handwriting look like? Did they use punctuation? Things like that. So we had to do it a totally different way. And it was really challenging, especially when it came to students who had inattention as something they needed support for. And they can turn their camera off anytime they want, or they can get up and leave anytime they want. Some of them, their older siblings were there at home with them. So that is, I had to really get creative that year. And I would not want to go back to that for anything. But yeah, we really just had to kind of, a lot of the students, you just couldn't give them everything that they needed, especially if they were at home that whole year.
On the topic of educational changes, are there any areas, whether in general education or special education, where you feel like we're just missing the mark as a society and you wish it was better?
I would say one of them is the first point about the overdiagnosis. I definitely think that's something we need to think about. And there's a couple of ways to go about that. The one that I would probably try first is, I would love it if there was some way that a district could have not just because normally in Texas, I think it's an LSSP that does most of the eligibility to get them into special education. I would love it if there was actually some type of way to add a diagnostician for things that are not necessarily academic, like say ADHD, things like that, because I think we could really, really be more specific about qualifying students. And I mean, the intention at this point is just, we need to make sure that these kids are getting the support they need. But sometimes it's a waiting game, and a kid, no student is alike. No two students are exactly alike, to where sometimes it's just, there's just a wake up call. And then one day, okay, yeah, it connects and it works for me. But the biggest thing that I wish they would do, I had a student that was a sixth grader, sorry. And we did what was called a DNQ. It stands for did not qualify, where you can graduate essentially a student from SPED services. And I pushed to do this because this student was absent a lot, and his grades suffered for it, because then he would just kind of, say, oh, it's no big deal. My parents say I don't really need to make the work up. And so he was failing, but it had nothing to do with what they said that his disability status was. So I took a couple of months, and I kind of worked with him. I said, okay, let's go over this. And I kept an eye on his test scores when he was around and things like that. And I said, I don't think he needs this level of support anymore. He can read the grade level material. He can answer the questions. It's a matter of effort at this point. And that I have not seen it since. Normally when we see a did not qualify meeting, it's at the beginning. Like they test them for something and they're like, no, it's not at that situation where they would be eligible in that area. I think we should be a lot more willing to say, okay, this student needed it at this point, but they probably don't now. And it's people shy away from that. Unfortunately, it's become to where special education, once you're in, you're in. And I really, really wish we could take a turn away from that.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned ADHD, and I think I have seen some people say this in the comments. Is that becoming something that also gets labeled as special education now?
It always has been in where I've taught. It was called, it's classified as an other health impairment. And that can include several different things. But it's a way to distinguish between like more of a, I would say, medical situation. Like ADHD requires a medical diagnosis to qualify in that area. You have to corroborate with a doctor to get that diagnosis. And it's a way to differentiate that from, say, a learning disability, which doesn't necessarily like impact them in, their daily functioning, but it is able to be diagnosed in the academic setting.
That's so interesting. I'm thinking when I was teaching, they would give sometimes people a 504 plan, but not designate them as SPED. And
Mm-hmm.
it might be something where maybe they had shorter assignments or they had like closer proximity to the teacher. But what kind of interventions would you have to do if you were pulling a kid that had ADHD as opposed to some of the other kids with more severe needs?
That depends. And I will say this, we do try to use 504 for students. I have a couple of them this year that they need the support, like for kind of staying organized and things like that, but not to the point where they actually need to be taught in a different kind of approach. So I think 504 is a great thing to do. It's unfortunate that most of it gets pushed over into SPED now. I think that there's probably some situations that don't warrant it, but every situation is different. But as far as like those accommodations, typically the accommodations for a 504 student would include those that can be successfully executed by one teacher, because a student with 504 would not justify like being in a classroom like I'm in where there's two teachers. So that's probably the main distinction there. Whereas a student that struggled significantly who has ADHD, and sometimes you can have more than one, there's coexisting areas of eligibility too, to where they would need more help. And they could be anything from like extra time. It could be shortened assignments. It could be modifying certain assignments or tests based on where their current level is. But at that point, if they required that much, usually a SPED teacher needs to be involved in that, because that's a lot of work to accommodate that student.
That makes sense. And I'm kind of curious, do you feel like as a special education teacher that you're kind of on the radar of admin and instructional coaches, or do you feel like they kind of leave you alone and just let you do your thing?
It depends on the campus. A lot of that is personality style. We have a lady who is our math interventionist or instructional coach. It kind of depends on the title they give them. She is absolutely amazing. I've gotten so many good resources from her. She's she's the one at PD that's like excited. Like, I saw this at the district meeting. You guys are gonna love it. We need to try this new thing. And of course, you'll have the what they used to call the old guard of teachers who are like, yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I know it works for me. I'm not going to touch that. And because math, admittedly, I've spent the least amount of time in my career actively teaching. I work very hard at trying to be more efficient at teaching it, particularly for the kiddos that I have that struggle with that and need more accommodations. And she has been a wealth of information. Her door is always open. She's never said, no, I need to get back to you tomorrow about that. She'll be like, come on in, let's dig into my stuff. Let's see what I have. And so she's excellent. I've also worked with instructional coaches that are so bogged down in what they have to do. Like at my campus, they actually teach students. And so they have their own essentially classroom of students that they have to work with, and usually one from different grade levels. So they're very stretched very, very far. So I would say that my involvement with instructional coaches, they've pretty much been available. There have been some that are a bit more rigid in their thinking to where they have their approach that worked for them when they were a classroom teacher, and that's what they push. But there again, this year I have that the math interventionist is always wanting to learn new stuff. She'll give anything a try. And from a SPED perspective, that's what we do anyway. It's like, okay, that didn't work yesterday, so let's try this today. And oh, it didn't work tomorrow, so we need to go back or it won't work tomorrow or whatever. So yeah, I've had some good experiences working with them.
Wow. Well, overall, everything you're sharing, it actually sounds like you've had a really happy teaching experience and that you're happy now. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you mentally navigate when you do have challenges so that you're still experiencing joy as a teacher?
I will definitely say that the last 2 years have been the better ones. I I haven't mentioned a lot of the really ordeal things I've dealt with because I've been fortunate enough that my student groups that I've had over the years, I've had just excellent kids that I've worked with. Even the one incident with that one student was it was not so common that I couldn't place my focus on the students that really needed me and really would respond. The most frustration that I've had over the years that I've been teaching is I'm one of those people that I have a hard time walking away if I haven't been able to solve that puzzle. My current coordinator can tell you, I have been in her office saying, why did people allow this to happen? Why were these people not on top of this before now? And whereas, some teachers might say, oh, whatever, I didn't make that mess. I'm not cleaning it up. I'm almost a glutton for punishment in the other direction where I'm like, no, I can fix this. I just need to figure out how to fix it. I'll give you an example. I have a student this year who is on the spectrum, and she had been in a we call it ALE here. It's for severely cognitively disabled students. And my coordinator last year, I had not met this student. She had meetings and meetings saying, no, she's okay. She could be in gen ed. It's just that she needed so much help with the social skills and things like that because she has autism. And so I said, okay, well, I look forward to meeting her. And then this year, she's very, I would say, almost advanced in math. She is a very good reader. Her comprehension is good, but because she has spent like 2nd through 4th grade in that environment, she's not been pushed. And so like every day is like a new discovery. Wait, you can do this? Oh my gosh. And so it's been a hard job in trying to change that reputation with the other teachers because they look at it as, oh my gosh, this kid should not be up here. She needs so much help knowing how to raise her hand. And I'm like, that's not her fault. And academically, this is where she's supposed to be. So those kind of things have been more frustrating than others. But as far as like how to stay, joyful is a better word than happy, because happy just isn't always going to happen on the job. But what keeps me going back is because there's so much satisfaction in the times, and it's like I told you so. For me, that's how it is. It's like, okay, everybody, it's the underdog thing. Everybody thought, okay, this is not going to happen. This student's just going to flounder and blah, 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 blah. And then they have that day where, everybody sees a new side of them, because I really firmly believe that's possible for all of them. But we have to be flexible in what that's going to look like. That's one thing that I think it's a shame, and it has to do with standardized testing so much, where we're not able to take the time and look at, okay, what does growth mean for this student or that student, or even students in middle school versus high school. It's a shame that we can't be more holistic about that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious, what do you wish, whether it's general education teachers or the public as a whole, what do you wish that people understood about a special education teacher's job?
If I had to pin it down to one thing, it would be that we have to constantly juggle where we want them to be on their IEPs, because IEP goals are different than, say, like the standards that they're supposed to learn for the year. Those vary. Whereas, like, I'll give you an example. For a reading goal, a grade level data assessment might look at, okay, can they identify the main idea? Whereas if they're SPED, they have that goal. We want them to be able to do that if possible, but their IEP goal would be that they are able to draw conclusions from a text, because what's holding them back from being able to do main idea questions is that they have trouble knowing what text to extract or information to abstract from it. And so I wish it was, and it's difficult to understand. I understand that it's a different animal, and you kind of have to adapt. That's one thing that I wish was more widely understood. And in fact, I've advocated for having part of professional development for all teachers to be, what does an IEP look like? How does it work? What's the logic behind this? Because I think it would make a lot more sense, and a lot more, especially gen ed teachers, would be like, oh, okay. And they'd kind of start to see how that can relate into how they lesson plan and everything like that. Because right now there's just such a chasm between, okay, you don't do the same job that I do, but I don't have time to understand that. Because as a SPED teacher, you have to constantly compare, okay, where are they IEP wise? And then how are they academically? Because if you're a co-teacher like me, you're still responsible to help them work on those grade level academics. And it's a lot to digest, but I do wish there was better understanding about that.
That makes sense. And I'm kind of curious, since you switched into education as a second career, I want you to imagine that there's somebody out there that's just like you, and they're thinking, wow, I think I would really like to get into special education. Are there any warnings that you would give them, where you've maybe seen other teachers not make it or end up not enjoying it, where you would say, hey, you might want to know this?
I would say, and I would probably take flack for this, I would say that the wrong reason to go into teaching is because you have kids, you like being around kids, things like that, because that's wonderful until you have a really, really bad day, and then that can shake your whole world. I would advise anyone who's coming from a different career, because a lot of things were so different, is teaching is very much political. It really is. And I'm not even really talking about with students and parents. Within organizations, when you go into a campus, especially the older the campus is, they've got things that they've done that way for a very, very long time. And it's really important, almost as important as getting to know your students and the curriculum, kind of get a feel for how that system works. Because I will tell you, rubbing admin the wrong way can affect your entire length of time that you're at a campus. And a lot of times it's unintentional. You just didn't realize, okay, this is how they want things done here. But because people's personalities come through in their teaching, it's just part of the art form that it is. There's just situations where you can step on toes and not know it. And you kind of have to be willing to set boundaries. And it's hard to do because you're kind of like, we're all in this together and we're doing this for the kids. And some people are not. That's just the truth of it. You're going to have, new teachers there to like, yeah, I'm going to do this for 20 years. And then you have the person that's at their 20 years who's like, okay, I'm just going to survive till May. And getting that person on board with you wanting to try these new things with the student, very unlikely that it's going to happen.
So you mentioned in the email something about a new policy called the teacher incentive allotment. And I don't know anything about that from Texas. Can you kind of tell us your perspective on that and what that is?
I'm not an expert on it, but they did introduce it. The idea of it started at the end of last year. That was when I first heard of it. It's basically an incentive program for teachers. And the overall idea of it is that based on student achievement, you can get financially awarded for it. So they're using our growth assessments that we do during the year. Fortunately, they're not going based on like the end of year standardized tests, because I think everyone can agree that that's probably an unfair assessment. And when we first heard about this, like incentive-based pay, especially based on test scores, every sped teacher's like, what? You do realize we're dealing with a different situation here. And so what we found out is that they're just looking at what we do. We do benchmark tests 3 times a year to kind of see, we get a baseline at the beginning of the year. Then we do one in the fall or in the winter time after that first semester. And then we'll do another one in the spring, so you can track growth for that individual student. And I think that's a better way to look at it, especially for students who get support or services. So basically that's the idea of it, is that teachers can be rewarded for getting more student growth. It's more popular with some than others. I'm still kind of trying to decide whether I think it's something that's practical, because I also think it kind of, in a way, it kind of drives it more towards, the financial side of it. When I just think, if it were me for a school district, I would love it if the standard scale, because like right now they have a system where you start out at one pay grade and as you go, it goes up, but it stops pretty low after your initial pay bump. Like in the first couple of years, it doesn't increase that much over the years, to where I would like to see something a little more constant with that, because the way, the current trends are with student academics and where they're at, as far as their skills, I'm not sure that that's the most fair way to assess teachers. It's not entirely bad, because at least it's looking at it from the perspective of every student can show growth. So I don't think it's a terribly bad idea. And I think as far as the teachers that are disengaged and just aren't invested much anymore, I think that's a decent idea, as far as like, okay, at least act like you want to be here, invest in the students, things like that. So that's the general idea of that.
So interesting. I like the idea of a bonus, as long as it's not like a pay cut, as long as they're not like, oh, you lose $10,000 if you don't hit this scale. So I can see how that could be something that would get a lot of people excited. So
well, that was my first question about it, is they're showing us these charts, and depending on the level of growth, you get points, and here's how much you can get. And I was timid. I didn't do it, but I was going to raise my hand and say, what happens if you don't? And it's not your fault. What happens if nothing happens? And I did ask one person later on outside of the meeting, and they said, well, nothing. It's like, it's a goal. You can, and that's as far as the understanding that I have of it, is it's not something to penalize per se, but it's for the people who, want to go for it, they can.
That's interesting. Really interesting. So I love to ask people, if you had a magic wand and you could change anything in education, what would you change?
I would change the ability of teachers, and it's a wild idea, but I think it would do a lot of good. I think every teacher should be given the opportunity to teach every level of education, say it's elementary, middle, and high school, because in my career, having a little taste of all of those has been a game changer for me. I think it would be amazing to see teachers get to see, here's what I'm doing, say working at third grade, compared to what it's like working with high school students. Because with that extra perspective, it can change the way you teach, because you kind of have a big picture view of what you're doing. And it's not very practical, but yes, if I had a magic wand, I would definitely make that an option for teachers.
That is so cool. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that. But even if maybe when you're kind of doing like student teaching, even if you got to like substitute teach or something in different grade levels, or just some kind of way to expose, teachers to every grade level, I do think that would be so cool. Well, this has been an awesome interview. Thank you so much, Sherri. And audience, thank you so much for watching. If you would also like to interview with me, feel free to email me at teachertherapytrish@gmail.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye for now, everyone.